Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time to the heart of the Roman Empire, specifically to the sumptuous yet somehow deeply mundane dining room of one of its most notorious rulers, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to history as Caligula. Now you've seen the movies, haven't you? You picture the scene: marble halls, piles of exotic roasted beasts, fountains flowing with wine, and perhaps the emperor himself reclining on a gilded couch, surrounded by whispering sycophants, maybe idly tossing pearls into his soup. It's a very vivid image, full of decadence and shocking excess. The reality, however, when you peel back the layers of sensationalized history and look at the actual logistics of Roman daily life, is far less exciting. That's why we're here tonight, to drift off to the truly boring history of imperial dining. We're going to slip silently into Caligula's Domus, his magnificent home on the Palatine Hill. You can almost feel the cool stone beneath your bare feet as you sneak past the sleeping guards. The air is heavy, not with the smell of rich perfume and roasted peacock, but with the more practical, slightly stale aromas of old olive oil and garum, the fermented fish sauce that was Rome's essential, pungent flavor base. Imagine standing right there, looking over the emperor's shoulder as he sits down for his evening meal. You expect a feast worthy of an Olympian god, a table groaning under the weight of unbelievable luxury. And yet, what you actually see is a paradox, a very rich man eating a very bland diet. The paradox is this: Caligula, known for his truly spectacular public cruelty and bizarre antics, like attempting to make his horse a consul, was also bound by the agricultural, storage and transport limitations of the 1st century AD. You see, wealth could buy more of something, but it couldn't fundamentally change what was available. The Roman diet, even for an emperor, relied overwhelmingly on basic cereals, a few seasonal vegetables, and a modest amount of wine. This isn't to say he never had a celebratory banquet. Of course he did. But on a Tuesday, after a long, stressful day of ordering people executed or starting pointless little wars, the emperor's dinner was probably not much more stimulating than your average weeknight meal, only made with less spice and infinitely more fish sauce. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic thud of grain being pounded in a mortar somewhere deep in the kitchens, the monotonous ancient sound of survival. This very mundane history, this focus on the daily bread of a man famous for his spectacular insanity, is what will lull you into a deep sleep tonight. You'll learn the names of forgotten wheat varieties and the simple, repetitive processes that fed an empire. It's the kind of information that demands absolutely no mental energy from you whatsoever. Just let the details wash over you. The fact that the most powerful man in the world still had to worry about the grain shipments arriving on time is a strangely comforting, monotonous thought. One mainstream historical fact to ease you in: the vast majority of the Roman population, including the soldiers who maintained the empire, subsisted primarily on a diet that was 90% vegetarian, centered around grains and pulses. Meat was a treat, not a daily occurrence, even in the imperial palace, due to the sheer cost and logistical difficulty of raising and preserving livestock in the climate. Now for the quirky tidbit. One way Romans actually tried to make their grain more palatable was by adding poppy seeds and honey, effectively creating a very early, very dense version of a sweet granola bar. A boring, healthy snack that Caligula probably ate for breakfast, thus starting his day with the same level of excitement as a modern civil servant. Historians still argue whether the actual amount of meat consumed by the imperial family, even factoring in sacrifices, represented more than 5% of their total caloric intake. That tells you just how much we're dealing with the tyranny of bread and porridge. You probably won't survive this deep dive into ancient Roman logistics without dozing off. It's just too technical, too focused on the things that make the world run, rather than the flashy stories that get remembered. And that's precisely the point. We are here to embrace the gentle, soporific quality of repetitive historical detail. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you down in the comments. I love to see how far these sleepy history lessons travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to begin by focusing on the absolute, unshakable foundation of the emperor's boring diet: the bread. We are still standing here, listening to the soft scrape of sandals on the marble floor of the Imperial residence, and the subject before us is bread, or more accurately, the grain that made the bread. You have to understand that in the Roman world, life revolved around cereals. It wasn't just a part of the diet. It was the diet. Even for Caligula, the foundation of every meal was some variation of processed grain. Forget your modern fluffy whole wheat artisan loaves. Roman bread was, by necessity, incredibly dense and often gritty. Imagine biting into something that required real chewing effort, sometimes leading to tooth wear, that we can still see in skeletal remains today. It's a good, solid, dull food, perfect for helping you count sheep. Before bread came porridge or pulse, which was probably the most ancient and consistent Roman food. Think of it as a thick, savory gruel made from far or emmer wheat. This was the staple for centuries, eventually giving way to the baked loaf panis, as the Republic grew and technology slightly improved. But even under the Empire, you could still find simple pulse on the table, often flavored with things like olive oil, herbs, or yes, more of that glorious, pungent garum. It's comforting to think that the ruler of the known world sometimes just ate a bowl of lukewarm, salty porridge. It really takes the imperial glamour down a few notches, doesn't it? The quality of the panis directly reflected one's social standing. The plebs received the dark, coarse bread, panis sordidus, dense, often contaminated with grit from the millstones, and frankly, a bit of a workout for your jaw. As an emperor, Caligula would have access to the finest white bread, panis candidus or siligineus, made from highly refined flour, sifted multiple times to remove the bran. It would have been softer and paler, a sign of extreme wealth and access to labor-intensive milling processes. But here's the key, and this is where the boring part comes in. It was still just wheat bread. The variations in flavor profile were minimal compared to what we expect today. The most exciting thing about it was its color, which is a very low bar for excitement. One mainstream historical fact about Roman grain, the entire city of Rome, which housed maybe 1 million people, required a constant, massive shipment of grain, primarily from Egypt and North Africa. This was the famous annona, the system of state-subsidized grain distribution that was absolutely essential for maintaining social order. If the grain ships were late, even Caligula would feel the political heat. This dependency on foreign grain made the entire empire vulnerable, a boring logistics fact that kept emperors and senators up at night, a quirky tidbit that brings the mundane to life. The Romans had a bakers' guild, the pistores, who were often freedmen or slaves, but who held an incredibly important position in the city. There's evidence of bakers being required to live on site, next to their mills and ovens, to prevent theft and ensure a steady supply. This meant they literally lived and breathed the smell of warm, slightly sour dough. Imagine the emperor's master baker, responsible for the most refined bread in the world, living a life that was utterly devoted to the repetitive, dull alchemy of flour and fire. Historians still argue whether the refinement level of the panis candidus truly approached the texture of modern white bread, or if it remained fundamentally heavier and tougher due to the limitations of their milling technology. Some suggest that even the emperor's finest bread was closer to a very dense sourdough than a baguette. You can almost hear the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the bakers at work, the creak of the grinding stone, the shee of the flour sieve, the gentle poof of the dough being kneaded. These are the soothing, predictable noises of a vast, complex society relying on the simplest of fuels. Think of how your dinner starts tonight. You pick up your fork, you choose your main dish. For Caligula, nearly every meal started with the ritualistic tearing of bread. It was used as a plate, as a spoon, and as the inevitable filler. It provided the majority of his calories and carbohydrates. He might try to hide the taste of the bread with rich toppings. We'll get to those later. But he could never escape the bread itself. It was his daily nutritional prison. And that's a beautifully dull image to hold on to. The emperor, surrounded by gold, chewing slowly on a piece of excellent yet inherently unexciting white bread. Now that we have the sturdy, if slightly bland, foundation of Caligula's diet, the ever-present grain, we turn our attention to what washed it all down: water and wine. Even this most basic element of the Roman day, a simple drink, is shot through with fascinatingly dull logistical facts that will gently guide you towards sleep. Imagine the sheer engineering marvel of it all. The aqueduct system. The sound of water running. Slosh, 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 miles and miles of it, channeled through the countryside, is one of the most soothing background noises of the ancient world. The Emperor's palace was, naturally, the endpoint of the best, freshest water. While most ordinary Romans had to fetch water from public fountains, a chore that involved long lines, heavy amphorae, and maybe a bit of gossip, Caligula had water piped directly to his residence. This was clean, cool water, often sourced from distant springs far from the mucky, closer-to-town rivers. For him, a simple drink of water was a constant, silent declaration of his absolute privilege. You can almost feel the chill of the marble basin where the water would constantly spill over, keeping the air slightly damp and cool. But water wasn't the default choice for the table. It was wine. Roman wine, however, was not the refined beverage we know today. It was thick, often syrupy, and usually quite strong. Crucially, it was almost always diluted with water. To drink unmixed wine, purum, was considered vulgar, reckless, and the sign of a drunkard, even among the most extravagant emperors. They had specific names for different mixing ratios. 2 parts water to 1 part wine, 3:2, was common. So when Caligula enjoyed a cup, he was mostly consuming aqueduct water, mildly flavored and preserved by the grapes. The quality of the wine itself varied wildly, and again reflected status. Caligula would have access to the finest imported vintages, perhaps from Campania or the islands, wines with names that today sound suitably pompous, like Falernian or Cetinian. But even these top-shelf beverages were often heavily flavored, not just with water, but with spices, herbs, or even seawater to preserve them or alter the taste. Think of it less as a fine Bordeaux and more as a powerful medicinal syrup that had to be heavily cut to be palatable. The process of pouring the wine from the storage vessel, amphora, into the mixing bowl, crater, and then diluting it was a slow, deliberate ritual, a series of quiet, repetitive motions. One mainstream historical fact to note is that the Romans were masters of lead pipes. While this made for excellent plumbing, we now know that it led to chronic, low-level lead poisoning, particularly among the wealthy who had lead pipes running directly into their homes. This dull, slow intoxication might have contributed to the erratic behavior of some emperors, including Caligula, though historians still debate the precise impact. It's a beautifully bland kind of historical poison, not a swift dagger, but a slow, quiet accumulation of metallic residue in the plumbing. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Roman palate. Because their wine was so strong and difficult to preserve perfectly, they were quite fond of adding pitch or pine resin to the storage amphorae. This imparted a unique, slightly acrid flavor that might seem awful to us, but was considered perfectly normal and even desirable to them. So imagine that subtle, almost turpentine-like aftertaste, accompanying every glass the emperor drank. It's a strange, lingering sensation that you don't have to worry about as you drift off. Historians still argue whether the effects of widespread lead exposure, even from things like lead-lined cooking pots and wine containers, were significant enough to impact the long-term political stability of the empire, or if the ancient writers simply exaggerated the correlation between plumbing and paranoia. Either way, the emperor's cup held a daily cocktail of water, wine, and ancient plumbing byproducts. You are reclining beside him now, feeling the comforting coolness of the stone couch. You hear the small, precise glug as the enslaved cupbearer pours the thick red liquid into the mixing bowl, followed by the soft, steady stream of fresh water. The entire exchange is silent, routine, and profoundly uninteresting. It's just the emperor, managing his hydration and his alcohol intake, under the massive, silent weight of his title. This is the simple reality that underlies all the dramatic stories. Life, even for a Roman emperor, was mostly a quiet struggle against thirst and logistics. Having covered the sturdy bread and the diluted wine, we now move to the slightly more colorful, yet still profoundly boring aspect of Caligula's diet: vegetables and garden produce. You might imagine exotic imports from the edges of the empire, but the reality is that the imperial garden, while vast and perfectly manicured, yielded mostly the same simple, hardy greens that every other Roman grew. The limitations of ancient agriculture meant that seasonal eating wasn't a trendy choice. It was a non-negotiable fact of life. You ate what was local and what was in season, even if you were the most powerful man on earth. Imagine walking through the Emperor's extensive vegetable patch on the Palatine. The sounds are just the gentle rustle of leaves, maybe the buzzing of a few bees. It's a world away from the political machinations inside the palace. You'd see huge patches of cabbages and onions, perhaps some fava beans drying on a rack, and massive amounts of lentils. These were the staples. The Roman diet was incredibly reliant on legumes and brassicas, foods that stored well, provided crucial protein, and were relatively easy to grow. Caligula would have consumed these in simple stews or boiled and dressed with, you guessed it, olive oil and garum. It's a very practical, if slightly monotonous menu. The truly rare items weren't necessarily the ones we think of as fancy today. They were the ones that were simply difficult to grow or transport. Asparagus, for example, was highly prized when it was in season, but its window was short. Similarly, specific varieties of lettuce or tender young sprouts were appreciated not for their flavor complexity, but for their texture and freshness, which were hard to maintain without refrigeration. The emperor's wealth mainly brought him the freshest possible version of a very simple list of ingredients. One mainstream historical fact to consider: the Romans did not have access to many of the most common vegetables we eat today. Potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, and corn were all New World crops, centuries away from being discovered by Europeans. This absence dramatically limits the flavor palette available to even the wealthiest Roman kitchen. Imagine a world without the acidity of tomatoes or the heat of chilies. The flavor base was instead earthy, salty, and oily. This reliance on herbs like mint, rue, and dill, along with copious amounts of salt, pepper, and that ubiquitous fish sauce, was a direct consequence of the missing New World ingredients. Here's a quirky tidbit about Roman greens. They were absolutely obsessed with mallows. These are not the fluffy things you roast over a fire. Those are modern marshmallows made with sugar. These are leafy plants whose leaves and roots were cooked, often boiled to a soft, almost slimy consistency. They were valued for being highly nutritious and slightly sweet. Imagine Caligula spooning down a bowl of slightly viscous, boiled mallow greens. It's certainly a peculiar royal preference. Historians still argue whether the Romans imported significant quantities of highly perishable specialty vegetables from Egypt or other nearby provinces, or if the costs and transit times simply limited the imperial table to what could be successfully grown in the immediate vicinity of Rome. Most evidence points to the latter, reinforcing the idea of a local, seasonal, and therefore limited menu. The beautiful thing about this scene is the quiet routine it represents. The emperor wakes up, the sun rises, and the enslaved gardeners are already tending the same familiar rows of beans and onions. There is a deeply soothing, repetitive quality to agriculture that translates into the emperor's boring plate. The gentle scraping of a hoe, the soft splash of water from a small earthenware jug, these sounds are far more characteristic of the imperial complex than the clang of armor or the shouts of a frenzied crowd. The emperor's power was absolute, yet his dinner was dictated by the simple, unyielding rules of the growing season. Let that gentle, seasonal rhythm carry you to sleep. Even a monster like Caligula couldn't escape the quiet necessity of eating his greens. Moving on from the quiet simplicity of the emperor's garden, we approach the topic of meat. If the diet was largely built on grains and vegetables, where did the protein come from? And did Caligula, the man who flaunted his power, really eat less meat than a modern person might? The answer, for the most part, is yes. Meat, particularly beef and pork, was a surprisingly rare luxury even for an emperor. It's an anticlimactic truth that makes for wonderfully boring history. For the vast majority of Romans, meat consumption was inextricably linked to religious sacrifice. When a sheep or an ox was sacrificed to the gods, a common and public ritual, the non-edible parts, bone, fat, etc., were burned as an offering, but the edible, choice cuts of meat were then distributed, often to the populace or sold cheaply. These events, not routine butchery, were the main source of meat for the common people. Caligula, as the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, presided over countless sacrifices and thus had the best access to the best cuts. But even for him, it didn't necessarily translate into a daily roast. Why was meat so rare? The logistics were brutal. Firstly, Raising large herds for slaughter was inefficient in terms of land use compared to growing grain, which had to be prioritized to feed the urban masses. Secondly, preservation was primitive. Without reliable refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. The primary method of preservation was salting or smoking, which fundamentally changed the texture and flavor, often making the result incredibly dry and tough. So even when Caligula wanted fresh meat, it was a race against time and temperature to get it from the field to his triclinium, dining room. Picture the immense effort required to bring a single, fresh, unsalted lamb to the imperial table. It's a quiet, complex chain of activity. The shepherd, the drover, the butcher, and the kitchen staff, all working against the clock. The very difficulty of the process reinforces the bland reality that meat was a status symbol consumed not for nutrition, but for ceremony and display. One mainstream historical fact that supports this rarity is the Roman love of poultry and game birds. Chickens, ducks, geese, and wild birds like thrushes were far easier to raise in small, manageable numbers or hunt locally than cattle, and they required less feed. These smaller animals were the emperor's most reliable source of fresh meat. You can almost hear the soft, nervous clucking from the imperial coops, a low, repetitive background sound that underscores the boring reality of his protein intake. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates Roman meat preservation. They had an absolute mania for dormice. These tiny rodents were raised in special clay jars, glirarium, and fattened on nuts and honey until they were plump. They were then either roasted or stuffed and were considered a delicacy. While not a massive source of calories, the effort put into farming, these little creatures shows a desire for variety where large game failed. Caligula may well have politely nibbled on a roasted, honey-glazed dormouse, demonstrating his refinement over his hunger. Historians still argue whether the amount of meat listed in ancient accounts of extravagant banquets was meant to be literally consumed, or if it was primarily a theatrical display of wealth, intended to impress and intimidate guests. Most agree the average daily consumption, even for Caligula, was probably closer to that of a modest modern vegetarian, supplemented by bits of fowl or dried. Salted pork fat, Laridum. So as you relax, remember the emperor is not tearing into a massive steak. He's most likely having a very small portion of finely sliced, possibly salted or smoked meat, perhaps mixed into a vegetable stew. His craving for protein was satisfied not by a massive portion, but by the subtle, repetitive flavors of simple, preserved fare. The logistics of the meat trade are slow, gentle, and utterly unexciting, perfectly designed to ease you into sleep. Now we arrive at the single most distinctive and arguably most necessary flavor of the Roman Empire. Fish sauce, known to all Romans, including Caligula as garum, or its finer variation, liquamen. This is the unsung, pungent hero of Roman cuisine, and its history is so repetitive and pervasive, it's perfectly designed to make you feel drowsy. You simply cannot talk about the emperor's boring diet without dedicating a moment to this fermented, salty, fishy liquid that was poured over virtually everything. Imagine the smell. The emperor's dining hall, for all its marble and pomp, likely had a lingering underlying aroma of salt, oil, and fermented fish guts. Garum was made by taking small whole fish, or just the entrails of larger fish like tuna, layering them with vast quantities of salt, and leaving them out in the hot Mediterranean sun for weeks, sometimes months, to ferment. The liquid that drained off was the prized garum. It was Rome's version of soy sauce, Worcestershire sauce, and salt all rolled into one, except arguably much, much stronger. Why was it so essential? Because the Romans lacked the variety of complex spices and flavorings we take for granted. Garum provided an intense boost of umami, a flavor concept the Romans didn't name but certainly understood, and salt, masking the blandness of the heavy grain and the sometimes off flavor of poorly preserved ingredients. Whether Caligula was eating his refined white bread, boiled cabbage, or a small piece of roasted dormouse, a splash of garum was almost guaranteed to be involved. It leveled the playing field of flavor across every social class, though the emperor's garum would be the highly filtered, very expensive variety imported from places like Spain, often stored in beautiful, sealed amphorae. The production of garum was a massive industrial undertaking, often relegated to coastal areas, far from the stench-sensitive noses of the capital's elite. Imagine those vast, sunny vats bubbling away in the coastal heat, the steady, low hum of flies and the quiet, persistent dripping of the salty liquid being collected. It's a very slow, very stinky process, the kind of boring logistics that kept the empire running and the emperor's food from tasting like nothing. One mainstream historical fact is that garum was so highly valued that it could sometimes fetch prices equivalent to fine perfume, and vast fortunes were built on its trade. The price difference between the common, sludge-like variety and the clear, refined garum sociorum, the source of the allies, was enormous, reflecting its importance as a luxury commodity. Caligula had access to the gold standard of fish brine, a suitably boring high-status luxury. A quirky tidbit that reveals the depth of their obsession. Romans used garum in sweet dishes as well. They would mix it with honey and wine to create a sauce for fruit, or even as part of a marinade for certain desserts. The combination of sweet and intensely savory was clearly a Roman preference. Imagine a honey-sweetened pear drizzled with a fermented fish product. Sleepy yet? Historians still argue whether the high salt content of the Roman diet, driven in large part by the massive use of garum and salted meat, was a significant contributing factor to hypertension or other health issues among the Roman elite. The sheer repetitive saltiness of their food is a constant theme in dietary analysis. So as you listen, imagine that faint, salty, slightly fishy scent that pervaded the emperor's palace. It's a constant, unchanging background note to all the high-stakes drama. The emperor sits and the servant approaches, not with a rare spice blend, but with a small cruet of refined fish sauce. It's the final, gentle reminder that even the most notorious Roman lives were dominated by the simple, practical, and utterly sleep-inducing necessities of ancient food technology. The sound of liquid pouring glug, glug, glug. Just let that repetitive sound ease your mind. With the core flavors of garum and bread established, we can now settle in for the emperor's main meal, the cena or dinner. This was the most important meal of the Roman day, a social ritual that defined Roman life, and the very routine of its scheduling is deeply soothing. Unlike our modern habit of grazing throughout the day, the Romans minimized or skipped breakfast and lunch, making the cena the central, calorically dense event. Typically, it began late in the afternoon, around the 9th hour, roughly 3:00 p.m., and could sometimes stretch on for hours, though perhaps not as dramatically as the sensationalized accounts suggest. The timing itself reflects a society that valued leisure. After the day's work, which for Caligula meant governing, attending sacrifices, or maybe just planning his next outrageous public appearance, the afternoon was reserved for the bath, and then the table. Imagine the sequence of sounds, the muffled activity of the kitchen staff preparing the last dishes, the gentle rustle of the embroidered couches being arranged, and the soft, repetitive plink of water dripping from the slaves' hands as they clean the final silverware. These are the slow, comforting rhythms of a major household preparing to shut down for the night. The cena was traditionally eaten in the triclinium, or dining room, where guests reclined on three-sided couches, lecti, leaning on their left elbow while eating with their right hand. Caligula would have his favored spot, the most prestigious position on the central couch. Eating while reclining is itself an unhurried, almost lazy act, perfectly suited for a sleepy history lesson. You are forced to slow down, the process of reaching for food. Passing it and drinking all become gentle, deliberate motions, punctuated by conversation that, for Caligula, was probably more about court politics than culinary appreciation. The meal itself often followed a predictable three-part structure: the gustatio, appetizers, the primae mensae, main courses, and the secondae mensae, dessert. The appetizers were light, eggs, perhaps some olives or small pieces of preserved meat, designed to stimulate the appetite. The main course, which we've established was mostly grain and vegetable-based, would be served in small successive waves. It wasn't a single enormous roast, but several small dishes brought out one after the other. It's this repetitive, rolling service that makes the meal so monotonous and sleep-friendly. One mainstream historical fact is that the Romans placed enormous social importance on where you sat and what you were served. At a large banquet, The quality of the food and wine could vary dramatically depending on a guest's status. Caligula would, of course, receive the best, purest garum and the finest wine, while lower-ranking guests might be served watered-down wine and coarser bread. This silent, subtle stratification was a constant reminder of the emperor's power, executed through the boring logistics of the serving schedule, a quirky tidbit that enhances the atmosphere. Romans often had small, caged birds in the triclinium, or used musicians to provide soft background music during the meal. Imagine the low, gentle sound of a simple flute or lyre, or the quiet, high-pitched chirping of a caged songbird. These were not loud, jarring sounds, but repetitive, ambient noises designed to accompany the slow consumption of food and the even slower flow of conversation. Historians still argue whether the frequency and extravagance of Caligula's legendary parties were truly a daily occurrence, or if the ancient biographers, like Suetonius, cherry-picked the most shocking events to illustrate his madness, therefore making his routine meals far more humble than we often assume. The truth likely lies in a contrast. Spectacular political theater a few times a month, surrounded by weeks of utterly pedestrian, grain-heavy dining. So lie back now. Imagine you are the lowest-ranking guest at the emperor's table, reclining not on marble, but perhaps a scratchy wool cushion, patiently waiting for the next course of boiled lentils. The conversation drones on, the wine is heavily diluted, and the slow rhythmic pace of the scene settles over you like a warm blanket. It's a long, predictable evening, and that is exactly the point. As we settle further into the quiet of the emperor's dining hall, the question naturally arises, how do we even know all these wonderfully boring details about the surprisingly bland Roman diet of a man who lived 2,000 years ago? The answer lies in the few, often biased, primary sources that survived and the painstaking, slow work of archaeology. The study of historical sources for this period is a profoundly gentle, quiet affair, perfectly suited for encouraging drowsiness. The main literary source for Caligula's life, and therefore glimpses into his habits, is Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, a biographer who wrote about a century after Caligula's reign. Suetonius wrote the lives of the 12 Caesars, and while his accounts are vivid and famous, they are heavily focused on the sensational, the sex, the cruelty, and the spectacular public acts of madness. He rarely spends time detailing the emperor's breakfast of plain bread and water. We have to read between the lines of the drama to find the dull domestic reality. This forces us to slow down, to consider the silences in the text, and to focus on the boring background details that the writer took for granted. For instance, Suetonius mentions Caligula's enormous capacity for food and drink at banquets, but he doesn't itemize the ingredients of a regular Tuesday dinner. The mention of enormous capacity is the sensational part. The truth that this capacity was mostly filled with bland cereals and watered wine is the part we must infer. This inference is where the truly boring yet crucial historical work happens. We must assume that even the most extravagant man was constrained by the universal realities of his time. One mainstream historical fact to remember is that much of our understanding of what Romans ate comes not from literary descriptions of feasts, but from archaeological digs. The contents of ancient Roman sewers, waste pits, and especially the incredibly preserved sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum, provide hard evidence, remnants of grain, carbonized fruit seeds, and fish bones. This process of sifting through ancient garbage, bit by boring bit, is what confirms the dominance of lentils, fava beans, and coarse grains in the everyday diet of all Romans, Imperial family included. It's the gentle swoosh of the archaeologist's brush that reveals the repetitive truth, a quirky tidbit that enhances the quiet mystery. Another key source for Roman recipes is Apicius, or De Re Coquinaria, on the subject of cooking. This is a collection of recipes from around the 4th century AD. While it details incredibly complex dishes involving rare birds and expensive spices, it also constantly calls for garum and relies on simple, readily available vegetables. The recipes are often highly impractical, suggesting they might have been for the most elite banquets, or even just theoretical high-status wish lists, not the daily grind of the imperial kitchen. The boring takeaway is that even the most extravagant recipe book was built on the foundation of the cheapest staples. Historians still argue whether the later accounts, particularly those emphasizing the worst excesses of emperors like Caligula and Nero, were heavily influenced by the political agenda of later dynasties, the Flavians, who sought to delegitimize the Julio-Claudian line by exaggerating their moral failures, especially regarding their dining habits. This subtle manipulation of history through sensationalism means we must gently push past the drama to reach the calm, logical consistency of the logistical reality. So as you listen, imagine the quiet library where a scholar is meticulously comparing Suetonius's gossip with the contents of an ancient cesspit. The goal isn't sensational discovery, but the subtle, repetitive confirmation of the mundane, the endless presence of lentils, the uniformity of the grain. It's a study in quiet contradiction, a notoriously wild emperor whose life, like the vast majority of his food, was surprisingly structured, repetitive, and bland. Let the slow accumulation of these small facts quiet your mind. The historical sources, as we've established, are often more interested in the sensational than the sensible. This brings us directly to the great historical myth that is highly counterproductive to a good night's sleep: the persistent, exaggerated image of imperial excess. When you think of a Roman emperor dining, you likely picture constant, non-stop orgies, where diners gorge themselves to the point of sickness, perhaps even utilizing a vomitorium to make room for more. Let's gently deconstruct this myth, because the reality of the emperor's daily life was far too practical for such constant, exhausting debauchery. Firstly, the word vomitorium is a magnificent piece of historical misinformation. It did not refer to a room for purging food. It was simply an architectural term for a passage or entryway in a Roman amphitheater or stadium, the place where the crowds would spew forth at the end of an event. The very idea of a designated space for vomiting is a later medieval invention, often used to moralize about the decadence of the pagan Romans. The Emperor Caligula certainly never had one in his palace. Secondly, while Romans certainly had banquets where drinking and gluttony occurred, usually at important festivals or political celebrations, these were sporadic events, not the nightly routine. Imagine the logistical drain of hosting an extravagant food-laden feast every single evening. The sheer cost, the immense labor required by the enslaved staff, and the difficulty of sourcing enough fresh, expensive ingredients, remember the meat scarcity, would make it financially and logistically unsustainable. The emperor, even one as reckless as Caligula, was still the head of an administration that required some level of sobriety and efficiency to function. You can almost hear the enslaved cook sighing, contemplating the preparation of another simple lentil stew. The effort of staging a single massive banquet would take days of preparation, quiet, repetitive work like cleaning silver, arranging flowers, and preparing exotic one-off dishes. This boring behind-the-scenes reality pushes back against the dramatic picture of daily, decadent chaos. One mainstream historical fact to ease your mind: while Romans did occasionally induce vomiting after a meal, it was considered a private and necessary medical act for those who had genuinely overindulged, not a public, celebrated social custom. It was a consequence of gluttony, not an intrinsic part of the dining ritual. The focus of their meals remained on social status and conversation. Here is a quirky tidbit about Roman dinner parties. Much of the excess that did occur was often centered on entertainment and spectacle, rather than just food quantity. Guests were often presented with live, costumed entertainment, poetry readings, or even small, quiet theatrical performances during the meal. The purpose of the extravagance was to demonstrate the host's wealth and cultural refinement, not solely to stuff the guests to bursting. The food was often just the backdrop for the real show. Historians still argue whether the frequency of Caligula's known excesses was genuinely higher than that of his predecessors, or if his sheer notoriety led later writers to focus only on the worst examples. Either way, the boring truth is that most nights, the emperor was constrained by the limits of ancient sanitation, preservation, and logistics, forcing him back to a simple, grain-based meal. So let go of the dramatic, noisy images of Roman parties. Settle instead into the quiet rhythm of the ordinary imperial evening. A small, carefully portioned meal, diluted wine, and the soothing, repetitive reality, that even an emperor's daily life was mostly mundane and scheduled. Let the sound of that historical myth crumbling be the final, gentle noise you hear before your thoughts soften. Now that we've established the emperor's main event, the lengthy cena, we can look at the other, even more minimal meals of the Roman day: breakfast, intaculum, and lunch, prandium. The history of these meals is wonderfully unexciting, because for the Roman elite they barely existed at all. They represent quiet gaps in the daily schedule, perfect for letting your mind wander off to sleep. The ientaculum, or breakfast, was usually taken right after waking up, which for the emperor was likely quite early, as the business of empire often started at dawn. It was almost always a small, quick affair. Imagine Caligula, dressing in his silk tunic, perhaps sipping a cup of water, or maybe a tiny portion of wine diluted even more heavily than his dinner wine. His meal would typically consist of simple leftovers from the previous day's cena: a piece of cold bread, maybe rubbed with salt or garlic, or perhaps a handful of dates or dried figs. It wasn't a social event, it was a practical necessity, fueling the body just enough to get to the main meal. The sounds of breakfast would be almost non-existent: a quiet chew, a soft sip, and the gentle rustle of a garment as he prepared for the day. The prandium, or lunch, was often a slight upgrade, but still nowhere near a large modern midday meal. It generally occurred around noon. Again, for a man like Caligula, it would be quick, eaten standing or seated on a simple stool, and focused on speed and simplicity. We are talking about cold cuts, if any meat was available, some leftover vegetables, and yes, more bread. Think of it as a small, unenthusiastic packed lunch. The entire transaction of eating was designed to be over quickly, avoiding any interruption to the day's business or social schedule. The routine nature of these early meals is incredibly soothing. It emphasizes the structured, repetitive nature of daily life, even for a mad emperor. The complexity of the imperial administration required a predictable schedule, and that schedule didn't allow for long, indulgent midday breaks. He ate simple food quickly and then moved on. The lack of variety and the focus on simple, storable, and cold food underscores the logistical constraints of the time. You wouldn't want the fuss of lighting a complex fire or employing a full staff just to heat up a small portion of cold leftovers. One mainstream historical fact to note is that the lack of substantial early meals among the Roman elite contrasts sharply with the habits of the working poor, who might have relied on a more substantial breakfast to fuel physical labor. Caligula, using his brain for intrigue and cruelty rather than his muscles for labor, required fewer quick calories. His wealth bought him the choice to skip the morning meal, but his daily habit remained one of minimal consumption, a quirky tidbit that brings a touch of flavor to the prandium. The Romans were fond of incorporating cheese into these quick meals. Often this wasn't the hard-aged cheese we might enjoy, but a soft, fresh cheese, similar to ricotta or cottage cheese, mixed with herbs and honey. Imagine a small wooden bowl of this simple cheese mix, eaten with a piece of stale bread. It's a sweet, gentle image of a powerful man enjoying a profoundly basic snack. Historians still argue whether the prandium was always eaten privately, or if certain close advisors were sometimes invited to share this simple midday meal, turning it into a brief, low-key political meeting. If it was a meeting, the conversation would have been hushed and quick, punctuated by the quiet sounds of eating simple fare. The emperor is constrained by the clock, the same clock that quietly ticks on for you as you settle deeper into your pillow. The early hours of the imperial day were a symphony of small, uninteresting, and repetitive acts. With the main structure of the emperor's boring, grain-centric day now understood, let's introduce a little touch of sweetness, though even this is remarkably simple. Forgotten fruits and sweeteners. For Caligula, the concept of a multi-tiered complex dessert with refined sugar was utterly alien. His sweets, like the rest of his diet, were dictated by the limitations of ancient agriculture and the lack of certain key ingredients. This simplicity is deeply calming to contemplate. The primary sweetener for all Roman desserts, and even many savory dishes, was honey. Sugar, derived from sugarcane, was known in the Roman world but was an incredibly rare, prohibitively expensive luxury imported from the furthest reaches of the East, treated more like a medicine or a spice than a daily ingredient. Therefore, the vast humming majority of imperial sweetening was done with honey. Imagine the soft, low buzzing of bees near the imperial apiaries, a sound that represents the quiet, daily labor that provided the emperor's only reliable source of sweetness. The fruits available to Caligula were also limited compared to a modern supermarket, but they were certainly enjoyed. The most common and enduring sweet fruit was the date and the fig. Dates, often dried for preservation, were imported from North Africa and the Near East, and were incredibly popular for their concentrated sweetness. Figs, both fresh in season and dried, were equally ubiquitous. These were often served at the secundae mensae, dessert course plain, or perhaps stuffed with nuts and a little more honey. Simple, repetitive, and wonderfully unexciting. Other seasonal fruits included grapes, which were of course everywhere, and apples and pears, which were small, often quite sour, and lacked the cultivation techniques that give us the massive, sweet varieties we enjoy today. Think of biting into a small, hard, slightly grainy apple. It's a far cry from a modern Fuji. The lack of breeding meant that even the emperor's fruit was a rustic, somewhat bland affair. One mainstream historical fact to consider: the reliance on honey and dried fruits meant that Roman sweets were often incredibly dense and rich in natural sugars, but lacked the light, fluffy textures of modern pastries. Their cakes, liber, were often dense honey-sweetened breads or cheesecakes, heavy enough to sit on your stomach like a small stone. Caligula's after-dinner treat was a carbohydrate-rich weight designed to aid the onset of a food coma, a quirky tidbit that adds to the flavor profile. The Romans had a particular fondness for quince, a fruit similar to a pear but much harder and highly aromatic. It was rarely eaten raw, but instead was slowly cooked down with honey to create a thick, jelly-like preserve. Imagine the gentle, low plop of this sticky fruit preserve being scooped onto a piece of bread, a quiet, predictable action in the imperial kitchen. Historians still argue whether the Romans used concentrated grape must, de frutum or sapa, which is grape juice boiled down to a thick syrup, more frequently than honey as a sweetener, especially in cooking. While de frutum was common, honey's distinct flavor and prestige likely kept it favored for the emperor's actual desserts. The quiet competition between these two simple sweeteners is another detail to let drift through your mind. So, as the emperor's cena draws to a close and a slave brings out a small platter of dried figs and dates, you realize that even his greatest indulgence is limited to the simple, sticky sweetness provided by nature and the repetitive labor of the apiary. The final gentle taste of his day is ancient, predictable, and utterly, wonderfully dull. Let's turn our attention from the food itself to the physical setting where Caligula consumed his surprisingly bland diet, the emperor's dining hall, or triclinium. The architecture and ambience of this space were carefully orchestrated to convey power and refinement. Yet for our purposes tonight, the subtle sounds and sensory details are what matter most. This quiet environment is designed to cradle your thoughts. The triclinium was usually positioned to receive the cooling afternoon breezes and often opened onto a pleasant garden or courtyard. The very act of eating while reclining on the lecti couches encouraged slowness and repose. Imagine the physical sensation of the cool marble floor beneath your feet and the comfortable pressure of the cushion supporting your arm. It's an environment built for relaxation and a lengthy, unhurried meal. The walls would have been decorated with frescoes, perhaps depicting mythological scenes or natural landscapes, creating a visual retreat. But pay attention to the acoustics. The vaulted ceilings and hard surfaces of the marble and stone meant that conversations, while hushed and formal, would carry easily. You would hear the soft murmur of voices, the gentle clink of ceramic plates, and the delicate scrape of a spoon on a bowl. There would be no loud music or jarring noises, just a constant, low, rhythmic background hum of domestic activity. This deliberate quietness was a feature of aristocratic dining. Loud, boisterous behavior was often associated with lower-class taverns. At the imperial table, refinement was measured in subtlety. The enslaved waiters, moving silently and efficiently, were trained to anticipate needs without speaking, adding to the atmosphere of gentle, almost theatrical silence around the emperor's couch. One mainstream historical fact to note is that Romans did not use individual plates in the modern sense. Food was often placed on a central table, and guests would eat from small serving dishes or use their bread to scoop up food directly from the dish. This lack of extensive, repetitive clatter from many plates and cutlery made the dining hall a surprisingly quiet space compared to a modern restaurant. A quirky tidbit that enhances the sensory experience. Wealthy Romans sometimes had dining couches made with bronze or silver inlay, but they were often covered in brightly dyed, soft cushions to make them comfortable for the hours-long meal. The plushness of the cushions contrasted with the hardness of the floor and walls. Imagine the soft, gentle poof as the emperor settles back onto his embroidered pillow. A small sound of comfortable indulgence. Historians still argue whether the practice of having long, detailed debates or readings during the cena was common, or if the guests, particularly in Caligula's court, mostly focused on light conversation and flattery to avoid offending the unpredictable emperor. Regardless, the need for some form of entertainment, whether a hushed debate or a quiet poet, filled the long, otherwise silent hours of the protracted meal. The beauty of the triclinium is that it was a space designed for slow, predictable time. The soundscape is one of repetition and muffled activity, the perfect setting for a story that asks you to slow down and listen closely to the quiet history of a simple grain-based diet being consumed slowly, hour after hour under the soft glow of oil lamps. Having established the setting and the staple foods, we can now gently touch upon the one or two moments where Caligula's dining habits did veer from the predictable, his own alleged food obsessions. We treat these not as the norm but as the odd, documented deviations from the daily blandness, the eccentric footnotes in his culinary history that still fail to truly excite. The most famous of these stories, though perhaps apocryphal and sensationalized, involves his attempts to dine lavishly and ostentatiously. One common tale suggests Caligula was fond of demanding pearls dissolved in vinegar as a drink, purely as a demonstration of insane wealth. The idea being that he would literally consume a massive fortune in front of his guests. This is the ultimate show-don't-tell of imperial extravagance. However, the boring reality is that ingesting crushed pearls and vinegar would taste acidic and chalky, not luxurious. It was a stunt, not a daily habit. Another minor obsession related to his grand projects was his interest in expensive, imported seafood. While the common folk ate small, locally caught fish, often preserved, Caligula was fond of the most costly imported varieties. One famous luxury, often demanded at banquets, was murex, a type of sea snail prized for its meat, and more significantly, the source of the extremely expensive Tyrian purple dye. Consuming murex was another way to literally eat money, as the dye cost more than its weight in gold. Yet even this expensive snail was still just a bit of protein, likely served with a generous splash of garum. These singular demands, reported by ancient historians, stand out precisely because they broke the pattern of simple grains and vegetables. They were flashes of theatrical madness, meant to shock and awe. The fact that the biographers seized upon these 2 or 3 moments of bizarre consumption underscores just how normal and unexciting the other, 99% of his meals must have been. One mainstream historical fact to consider: the emperor's interest in ostentatious dining, whether actual or alleged, was part of a larger Roman cultural phenomenon called luxuria, which critiqued the excessive display of wealth. Caligula was simply the most notorious example, used to argue for a return to simple republican values. His alleged gluttony was a political tool for others, a quirky tidbit that is strangely comforting. Caligula reportedly loved his horse, Incitatus, so much that he tried to make him a consul. Less famously, but related to food, Incitatus was said to have had his own marble stable, his own dining room, and was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. If the emperor's horse was eating a grain-based diet, just slightly embellished with gold, it reinforces the centrality of grain to the entire imperial lifestyle, man and beast alike. Historians still argue whether Caligula's specific bizarre demands, like the pearl and vinegar drink, were based on actual consumption or were later invented to fulfill the narrative requirement of depicting him as madly self-indulgent. The gentle conclusion is that whether real or rumored, these were exceptions that prove the rule of the bland, predictable Roman diet. Let the sound of a pearl slowly dissolving in a glass of vinegar be the final, gentle hiss of an overly dramatic anecdote fading away, leaving you with the quiet, soothing truth of the emperor's steady stream of bread and lentils. Let's venture quietly and gently into the heart of the emperor's domestic operation, the logistics of the imperial kitchens. This is where the boring history of the diet becomes a fascinatingly dull study in ancient management and efficiency. The kitchen was a world of disciplined, repetitive labor, perfectly designed to lull you to sleep with its constant, low-level activity. The imperial household employed a vast number of specialized, enslaved personnel to manage the food. There were the cooks, koti, often Greek freedmen or slaves who were highly skilled. But there were also the specialized staff whose job it was to manage the routine, tasters, pregustatores, who ensured the emperor wasn't poisoned, a genuine, if slightly dramatic, concern, butchers, servers, ministry, and the humble staff dedicated entirely to cleaning and preparing specific ingredients, like the pistores, bakers, we mentioned earlier. Imagine the soundscape of the massive kitchen complex. It's not the frantic noise of a modern restaurant. It's the steady, rhythmic thud of the mortar and pestle as spices are ground, the gentle slosh of water being poured for cleaning, the low, even hiss of a fire being constantly tended, since lighting a fire was a significant chore. The kitchen operated on a massive, methodical scale to feed not just the emperor, but his enormous retinue and personal guard too. The tools were primitive and their use was repetitive. No electric blenders here. All chopping, grinding and mixing was done manually. The cook relied on simple bronze or iron pots and pans and basic preservation techniques. The need to constantly replenish staples, manage the massive inventory of grain, oil and garum, and keep track of incoming produce required a huge amount of quiet. Repetitive administrative work. The truly boring history of ancient supply chain management. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the role of the taster. While it sounds excitingly dangerous, the taster's job was a serious daily necessity. This wasn't just a precautionary measure against political rivals. It was a check against accidental food poisoning, which was a genuine risk given the primitive standards of hygiene and preservation. The taster's quiet, serious gulp was a necessary step before every single meal. A quirky tidbit about the kitchen operation. The Romans had slaves called structores, whose sole job was to arrange the food on the serving platters in visually appealing ways. This quiet, delicate work involved placing small herbs, sprinkling colored spices, often simply ground saffron or other natural colorings, and arranging pieces of food into geometric patterns. It's a gentle, artistic endeavor unfolding in the noisy chaos of the kitchen, the quiet pursuit of perfection in the presentation of a simple bowl of lentils. Historians still argue whether the number of slaves dedicated to the imperial kitchen was a sign of true culinary complexity, or simply a demonstration of the emperor's ability to command vast amounts of human labor for even the most trivial tasks. Either way, the sheer repetitive effort invested in preparing simple fare reinforces its boring, predictable nature. So let your mind rest on the quiet efficiency of the imperial kitchen, a place of disciplined, repetitive movement. The steady chop, the low grind, the persistent murmur. These are the peaceful, predictable sounds of a machine dedicated to turning simple grain into the simple sustenance of the Roman emperor. We have reached the quiet end of our journey, bringing the surprisingly bland Roman diet of Caligula back into the larger context of daily life. The paradox we started with, a spectacular madman eating a simple, repetitive diet, is actually the most profound truth of his reign, and the final thought designed to soothe you into slumber. Caligula's life was one of exhausting political intrigue, constant public performance, and the heavy, continuous burden of absolute rule. He was surrounded by danger, flattery, and endless demands. His day was a long, taxing performance that began at dawn and concluded only after the lengthy, highly scheduled cena. The simple, repetitive nature of his diet, the bland bread, the boiled vegetables, the diluted wine, and the ever-present garum served as a necessary, quiet counterbalance to this chaos. The food was restorative, predictable, and fundamentally unexciting. It provided a steady, known stream of carbohydrates to fuel his stressful existence, without demanding mental energy or providing the further distraction of overstimulation. His meal was not a source of excitement, but a quiet, scheduled, and necessary refueling stop. One mainstream historical fact to conclude with is that the sheer monotony of the grain-based diet, though boring, was highly effective at sustaining a large, powerful population. It was the functional fuel of the empire, and the emperor himself relied on the same practical, carbohydrate-heavy basis as his least important soldier. A quirky final tidbit to tuck you in. The small, decorative Roman salt cellar or salinum was a prized object often passed down through generations. Salt was considered so vital that a specific, often beautiful vessel was dedicated to its use, emphasizing its importance over the more complex, exciting flavors that came and went. The simple, unchanging salt cellar at Caligula's table symbolizes the basic, unexciting necessities of life that even an emperor could not escape. Historians still argue whether the overall health of the Roman elite was compromised more by their frequent, brief periods of gluttony or by the chronic, repetitive consumption of lead and salt found in their daily boring staples. The question itself is one of quiet, gentle historical analysis, perfectly suited for the fading light. Now let the soft, repetitive echoes of the imperial kitchen fade into the deep, still dark. The emperor has finished his dinner. The last piece of bread has been consumed, and the servants are quietly extinguishing the oil lamps. The scent of olive oil and dried herbs is settling into the stone. The vast complexity of the Roman Empire, the noise, the drama, the cruelty, it all came down to a daily intake of simple, heavy grain. The world was enormous and terrifying, but the emperor's plate was small and predictable. Feel that quiet predictability settle over you now. The grain is secure, the water is flowing, the day is done. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of your own body settling into your mattress, the gentle surrender of muscle and bone. Let the dull, ancient fact of Caligula's simple, unexciting diet push all the sharper, noisier thoughts from your mind. There is only the cool stone, the faint, comforting scent of oil, and the beautiful, unchanging necessity of bread. Drift now into the deep, quiet, endless sleep. Let the boring history be your guide, and I'll see you in the next boring historical stories.